Netflix did something pretty cool by funding and releasing an unlikely passion project: love, death, and robots. As a sci-fi and animation lover, this gave me something I didn't even know I wanted. With its well-animated episodical structure, each with its own unique style, offered a fresh experience at every reset. And while the show isn't perfect by any means, there was still so much to like here. And with part of Volume 2 coming out recently, I decided to rewatch them all and compose a list of my favorite episodes. Each of these merits an entire video of their own, but with so many great ones already out there, I've decided to compile all the information and opinions I have and summarize them in a countdown of the 9 that made the biggest impact on me. And with that being said, let's start with the last but not least. From what I understand, the order of episodes is random for each person. For me, Sonnie's Edge was the first one, the one to set a precedent for the rest of the show, and as such, I think it did a pretty good job. It didn't have the best looking artwork or deepest story out of the bunch, but its drenched in neon, gladiator-style arena setting was definitely enough to capture my attention. Cyberpunk is up there in terms of my favorite genres, and I thought its tone is embodied rather well here. By far the coolest thing about the episode was the fight, which takes on a whole new meaning once the double twist is revealed and you realize that it's actually Sonnie herself that's down there fighting in a pit. That's her edge. And it worked for me. I was entertained and overall really enjoyed this one, leaving me with a solid first impression of the show. I feel very similarly about Shapeshifters as I do about Sonnie's Edge, with the highlights for me being the scene leading up to the fight, with the camera work panning over the gruesome casualties, as well as the fight itself. I thought the idea of werewolves being a known and integrated part of society used in combat was a pretty interesting idea on paper. Werewolves symbolize humanity's focus on its primal nature, where through a loss of control, one gives into their impulses, trading intellect for raw strength, the embodiment of becoming wild. And removing these mythical creatures from folklore and placing them in the midst of a controlled and disciplined environment would bring its own set of challenges. But doing so with the additional expectation of building a brotherhood and fighting alongside another species that fears and hates you adds yet another factor to an already complicated situation. And I just can't help but feel that something more could have been done with such a nuanced setup. Nonetheless, I enjoyed this episode for what it was, and I feel like it earned its place on my list of favorites. This is a narrated piece that centers around the washed-up body of a dead giant, and the fleeting admiration the locals have for such a phenomenon. As you would expect, everyone is exploratory at first, but it isn't long until curiosity and appreciation turn into casual acknowledgement and eventually straight-up defiling. This reminded me of the two environmental artists, Christo and Jean-Claude, whose work can be referred to as gentle disturbances that make people become more aware of their surroundings. It's human nature to become accustomed to things, and while that's a feat that makes us pretty amazing and resilient creatures, it's often accompanied with a loss of interest or enthusiasm for them, no matter how impressive they may be.
Les gens vont voir le pont-neuf peut-être d'un autre œil, enfin c'est une démarche.
I was in awe the first time I saw the Roman Colosseum in real life, but for natives who may have enjoyed that site all their lives and drive past it every day, that feeling may not be as intense. Christo and Jean-Claude recognized this part of our nature and incorporated it into their art, which often involved wrapping significant landmarks or landscapes in fabric. The purpose of this would be to hide from sight these amazing views in order to evoke a renewed appreciation for them once they're revealed again. meaning that for a lot of us, this appreciation is something we must work on in order for it to be maintained. Unfortunately for the drowned giant, those around him were unable to do so, and so he dissolved into obscurity, with rare pieces scattered around town being the only evidence that he even existed. What I liked most about Good Hunting was the vast amount of world building that was achieved in a very short amount of time. Ancient China is turned into a pretty awesome steampunk version of itself, providing the perfect setting for exploring generational gaps and the importance of adapting to sudden change. We see rapid industrialization, which also means rapid eradication of its magical creatures. Therefore, adapting became essential to Hooligans' existence. And humans aren't exactly exempt from this, as Liang states that living in this world would have only been a burden to his father. The next generation, however, Yang and Liang, found ways to thrive by learning how to take advantage of certain aspects of their new reality by modernizing them. Since the forest was replaced with a concrete jungle, fittingly magic was replaced with automata. The idea of who needed to be hunted changed as well, and therefore Liang changed the idea of what it means to be a hunter, effectively showing the growth and transformation of each character respectively. This is one of the longer shorts, but time was still a limitation, and although I would totally be open to seeing more of its interesting lore, I still felt like I got a complete story by the end. The theme is interesting and relevant. The 2D animation was a great choice that complemented the story, and the time and setting made the transition from mythical to manufactured believable. All in all, I think everything came together beautifully for this one. Whether it's joy, beauty, or horror, each episode of the saga leaves its own distinct sensation for you to grapple with once it's over. I just could not pinpoint exactly what it was that the Fish Night made me feel. But one thing was for certain, it won me over with its beauty, as the bland, lifeless desert blossomed into a garden of colorful spirits freely roaming what once used to be their home. In the midst of this are two men with different reactions to the situation. The elder having a more conservative approach, while the younger one allows himself to be carried away without so much as a second thought. Just like in Good Hunting, their respective responses made me feel that there is some commentary on their generational gap here, with the two men giving off strong father and son vibes. The father figure being the more cautionary of the two, and the younger man recklessly not listening to his advice. Later, I read a theory that this is actually an allegory for the young man not surviving the night, probably due to dehydration. And I like this explanation quite a lot. I sort of tied it into my own, and with this added context, I could finally pinpoint the combination of things this episode made me feel, and the best way to describe it is hauntingly beautiful. Really standing apart from the rest of the bunch is The Witness, showing a cyclical relationship between witness and victim of a murder, told via a non-stop, action-packed pursuit of one another. And it looks incredible, blending in the colorful, hyper-realistic streets of Hong Kong with the more cartoony design of the characters at its forefront, occasionally spelling out the taps, booms, and crashes, comic book style. This episode was dynamic in its theme and execution, evocative of a bad drug trip, or in this case some sort of cosmic punishment, as these two interconnected characters cannot shake the other one off, despite the irreparable damage they cause to one another. Displaying the back and forth of a toxic relationship that, as hinted by the opening symbol of the serpent eating its own tail, will go on for infinity. The only time either of them are close to looking appeased is when lust is smacked right down in the middle between them, holding them in the same place for a brief moment. The whole thing just looked really cool, and it was made for this type of short-form content, showcasing the type of creativity I would love to see more of in the future. One of my favorite things about science fiction is the infatuation of exploring the conflict within ourselves when it comes to the topic of mortality, with stories often approaching that complicated relationship in dystopias, which is what Pop Squad is. Right away, I was reminded of one of my favorite movies ever, Blade Runner, which immediately established a bias in my head. And with that acknowledged, I would say that this is one of the best episodes in the series, hands down. It establishes a world in which those who live forever, like self-proclaimed gods, live up in the heavens, intentionally far removed from the realities of those who are affected most by the new living conditions. Another tactic they use to remain disconnected from harsh procedures of population control is the word parent being replaced with breeder, dehumanizing those who decide to commit the criminal act of having a child. The only person we see alternating between these two worlds is Detective Briggs, who is dealing with his inner struggle of wanting to be a father, but unable to do what it takes in order to make his wish a reality. When he's at the top, we see how having infinite time has given humans opportunities to perfect themselves in ways they normally wouldn't be able to do in a single lifetime. When he's at the bottom, we see that these achievements are meaningless to those whose lives have been stunted by the inability to share them with a fresh new life. Knowing our time on Earth is finite is what makes us feel as strongly as we do about everything and everyone around us. Mortality is the one thing we all share and collectively gives us meaning. And so Detective Briggs finally finds meaning in the most fleeting of moments, the sensation of raindrops trickling down his face as his life slowly escapes his body. His arc is complete, and it was painful and heartwarming, bleak yet hopeful, which is how this episode climbed its way this high up on my list. This one was in competition for my number one slot, but shied away from it for one main reason. I think that Beyond the Aquila Rift greatly benefits from the additional knowledge in its original source material, and may have been better off with more time to fully develop its story, which I want to discuss by sort of working backwards, as it ends on a harrowing note where we see Tom's ship, among others, captured and stuck like flies in a spiderweb. The creature holding him hostage in a make-believe world is called Greta, but besides the terrifying outwardly appearance, is she really the bad guy of the story? Earlier, Greta explained that her ship was the first to get lost and end up in this place from which there's no escape. Luckily, her ship was well equipped and they were able to settle there. Eventually, they would encounter more ships that would get lost on the same route, but upon hearing the bad news that there was no way out of this place, some of the newcomers would go mad or attempt to kill themselves. In order to ease their transition into their new reality, Greta started creating these simulations, pacifying newly lost passengers by using the comforts of their own memories, slowly releasing them from her spell once they're ready. Sometimes this plan would fail, and she would work over and over on these simulations, trying to tweak them along the way in order to get better outcomes. You can tell she's genuinely distraught about the fact that Tom wanted out before he was truly ready. Tom was the first human ship to make it there, which would make acclimating that much harder. She didn't want him to suffer, but also selfishly perhaps wanted to continue this relationship with him that she worked so hard to build. And while it's definitely interesting to ponder which choice one would make in the situation, I found Greta's role in the scenario even more fascinating. But again, through the added context of the book, which lessened the impact of the episode for me. My number one pick was coincidentally, or probably not, written by the same author as Beyond the Aquila Rift, but I think this one felt a little more complete to me. And while it's becoming redundant at this point for me to say just how beautiful all of the episodes are, I simply can't not point out how uniquely gorgeous the art of Zima Blue is, and how it worked perfectly to capture the essence of its story, proving that animation can be taken seriously as a medium by adults, even without that M rating. What I loved about the story is that using the topic of art, it's simultaneously a micro and macro depiction of the human state. Zima's evolution is sort of like a single-celled organism evolving from its simplest form into the complex species we are today. But if zoomed in, it also depicts the growth of an individual from childhood to adulthood, and all the baggage it brings with it. Some will argue that the more you know, the less happy you are. There is no putting the genie back in the bottle after all. The more broad your worldview, the better your understanding of your role in this world, and the impact or non-impact you may be having on it. Your need for stimulation heightens, and you start to see the flaws in everyday things. None of these burdens plague you as a child, and as Zima became more advanced, gaining more and more access to the vast array of knowledge, the bigger the longing for him to return to his purest form, a time when he was happiest. Visually, this correlates with the growing presence of Zima Blue on his artwork, eventually dominating the entire canvas and becoming his last performance. On this journey of stories about robots, to me, this felt the most human. All anyone ever wants is to be happy. It's as simple and as complicated as that.